Good afternoon. Welcome to the Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to the US military action in Venezuela, as the President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela was captured by the US military. So we will discuss the US policy of interventionism. The second article is related to the declining fertility, as Telangana ended the two-child ceiling for the contesting of local body polls. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified section which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to the US military action in Venezuela, as the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro was captured by the US military. So we will discuss the US-Venezuela ties, the rationale behind the regime change that the US wants in Venezuela, the policy of US interventionism, the role of India amid this turmoil, and also the India-Venezuela relations. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developed and Developing Countries on India's Interests and Indian Diaspora. First, let's start with a brief background on Venezuela. Venezuela is a country which is strategically located in South America. It is bordered by Guyana in the east, Brazil in the south, Colombia in the southwest, and it also shares its boundary with the Atlantic Ocean in the northern side. The capital of Venezuela is Caracas. Now, why is Venezuela so significant? Because it holds the world's largest proven oil reserves. It accounts for about 17% of the world's proven oil reserves, that is about 300 billion barrels of crude oil. But the oil exports from Venezuela, they have been limited. For example, in the year 2023, the oil exports from Venezuela were just about $4 billion worth of crude oil, whereas the oil exports from USA, Russia, Saudi Arabia were more than $100 billion of crude oil annually every year. Interestingly, the oil export revenues and the taxes paid by the state-owned oil company in Venezuela, that accounts for more than 50% of the state income of Venezuela. Therefore, because of the sanctions imposed by USA, which reduced the oil exports from Venezuela, there was a turbulence in the GDP of Venezuela. The graph, we can observe that the GDP of Venezuela has contracted by more than 70% in the decade from 2014 to 2024. You can see a brief spike also in the year 2023 because of the relaxation in the sanctions which were given by the Biden administration through the Barbados Agreement. That was to ensure that the free and fair elections are conducted in Venezuela. But the Venezuela rather disqualified the opposition leader Maria herself. Therefore, the sanctions were reimposed by the USA upon Venezuela, which again led to the decline in the GDP. Therefore, Venezuela has not only experienced economic turbulence but also the political turbulence. The Venezuela elects its presidents for a term of 6 years, and there are no limits on the number of terms for which a person can be elected as president. Now, coming to the US-Venezuela relations specifically, the ties between the two countries are characterized by a quid pro quo dynamics. For example, Venezuela wants the restrictions upon it to be eased. It wants the sanctions upon it to be lifted by USA so that it can export more oil, it can generate more revenue. But at the same time, President Nicolas Maduro wanted to retain the power. On the other hand, USA wanted a regime change in Venezuela. Why? Because it wanted the access to the oil reserves of Venezuela. And that was not possible effectively as long as the oil resources of Venezuela are nationalized. Therefore, USA wanted a non-left government in Venezuela. The government of the President Nicolas Maduro was pro-left. It was leftist in nature. Therefore, they wanted to trigger a democratic transition. They wanted to trigger a political transition in Venezuela. And hence they were utilizing the sanctions as a political leverage to trigger a political transition there. But that did not happen. Therefore, it went for direct intervention. The Latin American countries, for example, Venezuela, have been a victim of the US interventionist policies. And therefore, it has created a regional divide also. For example, the elections in Venezuela were disputed, the last two elections especially, in 2018 also and in 2024 also. After the 2024 elections in Venezuela, President Nicolas Maduro claimed victory. He was even congratulated by Cuba, for example. But some of the other Latin American countries, they questioned the results of the elections. For example, Argentina, Chile. Therefore, there is a regional divide created in the Latin America. Also, in the US-Venezuela ties, there have been a downward spiral continuously over the past decade, especially. For example, during the administration of Obama, sanctions were imposed upon the officials of Venezuela over the allegations of corruption and also human rights violations. During the first term of the Trump administration also, the sanctions were further escalated to target the foreign entities which were engaged in the oil business of Venezuela, especially the Chinese firms and the Russian firms operating in the oil sector in Venezuela, because the US wanted its own dominance to gain control over the oil sector of Venezuela especially. The USA even recognized the opposition leader Juan as the interim president in 2018 after the 2018 elections were also disputed. The so-called interim government even continued till 2022 before it finally collapsed, before even achieving its final objective, that is ensuring a regime change. Then the Biden administration also reached a Barbados agreement with Venezuela while relaxing the sanctions upon Venezuela in exchange for conducting of free and fair elections in Venezuela, as they finally wanted the regime change only. But the Venezuelan administration disqualified the main opposition leader Maria Corina herself, which led to the reimposition of sanctions upon Venezuela and also even the revocation of the oil license also. This led to the migration crisis also being used as a leverage by the USA, because there were migrants from Venezuela who were entering into USA. The citizens of Venezuela were fleeing and they were entering into USA. The USA started the repatriation flights, but the repatriation was blocked by Venezuela in retaliation of the economic sanctions which were reimposed upon Venezuela by the USA. Then finally the USA resorted to the military escalation also. For example, they targeted the civilian boats in the Atlantic Ocean, alleging that they were carrying drugs into USA. They deployed the jets and warships in the Atlantic Ocean. They deployed the troops in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, what was its impact? The impact of the downgrading of the US-Venezuela ties, it led to the European nations also imposing the sanctions upon Venezuela. The European sanctions were more targeted, they were more specific. For example, they imposed travel bans upon the officials of Venezuela who were allegedly involved in the human rights violations or abuses, and they went for the asset freezes rather. It had an adverse impact on Venezuela. For example, the oil production in Venezuela declined. In 2001, the oil production in Venezuela was to the tune of 3 million barrels per day. In 2024, it was less than 1 million barrels per day. And therefore, it led to inflation also. The hyperinflation was to the tune of 180% annually. And it created artificial shortages as well. The shortage of food, fuel, and medicine, which led to the citizens fleeing Venezuela. More than 7 million Venezuelan citizens fled Venezuela. Therefore, it had a counterproductive outcome. Rather than the Western nations achieving their aims, it led to Venezuela moving closer to China and Russia. Therefore, the regime change was also not achieved. And finally, the military option was exercised by the US administration, by the US military, which captured the President Nicolas Maduro himself. Now, why does the US want a regime change in Venezuela? The immediate rationale, the reason given behind the military action in Venezuela is the allegation that there is a nexus between the drug cartels and the Venezuelan administration. The President Nicolas Maduro was formally charged of drug trafficking, and the USA declared a war on drugs. Therefore, they started targeting even the civilian boats also in the Atlantic Ocean, and they even authorized the CIA, the agency in USA, of conducting clandestine operation, secret operation in Venezuela, and even imposed a naval quarantine on the oil tankers coming to or from Venezuela. They even conducted large-scale airstrikes therefore in Venezuela, finally capturing the Venezuelan president himself. The real reasons are the geopolitical and strategic reasons. For example, the USA wants to ensure that there is American primacy in the Western Hemisphere. Therefore, even their national security doctrine mentions that the Latin America, the Caribbean countries, they are a strategic priority for USA. And now there is the Monroe Doctrine. It is the Trump's version of the Monroe Doctrine. That is, the American primacy must be there in the Western Hemisphere. They need to curb the influence, curb the control of any outside powers, especially China, so that the Latin America, the Western Hemisphere, remains under the American civilian, political and military influence. It remains under the control, under the sphere of influence of America only. That was essentially the Monroe Doctrine. And they also want to ensure that the Chinese and Russian influence in the region can be curtailed, because China's investments in the region have been significant. As the Venezuelan oil, the largest importer of that is China only, and it has even signed the deals with Venezuela, for example the $1 billion investment deal in 2024, and it is majorly controlling the oil resources in Venezuela. And the Venezuela and Cuba, they have the left-wing governments. Therefore, it wants to ensure that in the Western Hemisphere, the sphere of influence of China and Russia should not expand, and it will serve as a message to the other regional powers in the Latin America, so that they are not moving closer to Russia and China. And Trump has been seen to be supporting the far right figures in the Latin American countries also. For example, supporting Bolsonaro in Brazil, supporting Javier Milei in Argentina. At the same time, one of the biggest reasons is the access to the oil reserves, because Venezuela has 17% of the world's proven oil reserves, and therefore Trump even demanded that Venezuela should return the stolen American oil, land and assets. Why stolen? Because essentially Venezuela had nationalized the oil resources there. Therefore, the oil fields, the mines, the assets, the land that were bought by the American companies, they were nationalized by the Venezuelan government, and therefore it also wants to reduce the US dependence upon the Persian Gulf. Trump wants to secure the Venezuelan oil for the American companies, for example ExxonMobil, the Gulf Oil, so that they are not dependent more upon the Gulf region for the oil imports. And in 2019, they even demanded the Juan, the opposition leader in Venezuela, to commit that they will be securing the US interest by essentially opening up the oil sector for the USA, and for ensuring that they will be ousting the Russia and China from Venezuela. And they are even supporting the opposition leader Maria Corina Machado also, because she is seen as supporting the policies of Trump administration, and she has promised that she will be opening the oil sector, the power sector, for the foreign companies, especially the American companies, to invest in Venezuela. Now let's look at the roots of the Venezuela's drug nexus as well, because it is the major allegation leveled by the USA and the stated reason behind the capture of the Venezuelan president. Interestingly, Venezuela is a major transit hub for the drugs cartel. It is not the major producer of cocaine. Colombia is the major producer of cocaine, and there are other drug transit routes also. The significant routes are through Mexico, through the Caribbean countries into the USA. Therefore, there is an allegation that there is systemic complicity, that the Venezuelan president and his top aides, they are also involved, but these are allegations. The so-called evidence which is given by the USA is the admission by the former intelligence chief of Venezuela, Hugo Caraval, in a US court, that there is a nexus between the drug cartels and the administration. And Venezuela says that it is an allegation which is politically motivated, because the US DEA data itself shows that the drugs quantities which are coming into USA, they are more through the Guatemala route or through the Honduras route. But at the same time, there are internal fault lines also, and there are systemic weaknesses. For example, within Venezuela, there is entrenched corruption within the judiciary also, and there is collusion with the security forces as well. And also there is a weak state capacity in ensuring the law and order. At the same time, the borders between Venezuela and Colombia are porous. These are used by the drug lords to flee to the other country. There are even secret airstrips in the border region, and the drug lords use it just like Pablo Escobar. Within the US also, there are internal fault lines. For example, the drug demand in US is significant. In the past 25 years, there have been 3 waves of increased opioid overdose deaths, and therefore the drug demand in the USA needs to be brought down rather. At the same time, internationally there is no legal mechanism to resolve such disputes. The UNODC also has limited power, it lacks the enforcement internationally. Therefore, what can be done to resolve such drug disputes? One, there can be a regional response. For example, setting up a Caribbean counter narcotics task force, which can be monitored by the neutral countries, ensuring that there is intelligence sharing, there is coordinated patrols, or the finances of the drug cartels can be targeted. For example, there can be judicial frameworks which can be put in place so that there are asset freezes for the drug cartels which are using cryptocurrencies, etc. At the same time, the demand for the drugs can also be reduced. For example, the Portugal model, which went for decriminalization, rather the focus was imposed upon the treatment so that the demand itself can be reduced, and the confidence building measures can be put in place. For example, joint patrols under the oversight of the United Nations or the regional bodies, etc., so that the mistrust can be brought down. The framework itself can be shifted. For example, the narcotics, it should not be treated as a military conflict. Rather, it should be treated as a governance and human security issue. At the same time, the international bodies can be strengthened. For example, the resources can be given to the UNODC, its capacity can be strengthened further so that there can be better enforcement as well as oversight also from the international bodies. Now, this is not the only case of US interventions in the other countries under one pretext or the other. There are several examples of the US interventions in the Latin America. For example, in 1888, it intervened in Cuba, which was due to the Spanish-American War in 1898. In Nicaragua, again, it intervened in the middle of a revolt against the right-leaning and the pro-American president because it wanted to save the regime. In Mexico, it intervened again in 1914 to overthrow a Mexican president in favor of another one who was seen as more pro-American. In Haiti, it intervened when President Sam of Haiti was assassinated in order to restore order in Haiti. In Chile, it intervened and ensured that there was a coup d'etat there and there was the involvement of CIA as well there. In Grenada, it accused the Grenada government of building an airport that would project the Soviet power in the region. Again, it intervened in Panama in 1989 by paying the military general Noriega to help sabotage the left-wing Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Therefore, the intervention in Venezuela has further reduced the Western legitimacy, which is already declining because of several factors. For example, the credibility of Western institutions is often questioned. For example, the opposition leader of Venezuela itself, Maria Corina, she was bestowed upon the Nobel Peace Prize, despite the fact that she was supporting the US military strikes on the soil of her own country. She was also seen supporting the actions of Israel in Gaza as well. Also, there has been a weaponization of the neutral platforms. For example, SWIFT, the Russian banks, they were disconnected from the SWIFT system, and there has been a simultaneously selective application of the rules. For example, Russia and Belarus, they were banned from participating in the Paris Olympics 2024 because Russia invaded Ukraine and Belarus supported Russia in the misadventure. But at the same time, Israel was allowed to participate, despite the International Court of Justice findings that there may be a genocide in Gaza conducted by Israel. Similarly, the SWIFT disconnection, for example, it happened for Russia but not for Israel. The IMF and World Bank, they also restricted their ties with Russia but not with Israel. So what has been the impact on India's core interests? These declining legitimacy of the West, it creates a global instability. The decline in stability, it declines the global trade. It reduces the global trade. It creates an instability in the energy prices. All of these factors adversely impact India's economic growth. So what can be India's role amid this turmoil? First, we need to remain non-aligned. We can't be aligned with the interventionist policy also, so that we can gain the trust of the global south as well as the countries in which US is going for interventionism. We can retain our image that India is a neutral country, and we also need to uphold our principle of strategic autonomy because we can't be seen to be aligned with any one bloc, either the Western bloc or the Eastern bloc, for example China, Russia, and therefore India has a unique strategic position and we can function as the advocate for multipolarity. In an era where there is a vacuum of legitimacy, India can provide that legitimate alternative. Therefore, we can play the balancing role in the BRICS Plus, for example, so that the expanded BRICS does not become an anti-Western coalition. We need to seize this opportunity for leadership and exercise our advantage, the inherent soft power advantage that India has, and even the West can also give us support. There is internal Western support. For example, within USA, the public, the elites, some of them are of the view that India is the least threatening alternative, and the US dominance in the global institutions comes at a cost. Therefore, if we are stepping back, then India can assume a greater role. At the same time, India can function as a catalyst for promoting economic decoupling, that is moving away from the dependence upon dollar. The trade can happen in the other currencies also. For example, within BRICS, the trade can happen in the yuan as well. Similarly, India can assume the role of a cultural leader because there is a vacuum in the cultural sphere. In the financial sector, China is investing heavily in the global financial architecture, but in the cultural sphere, there is a vacuum, a leadership vacuum. India can fill that gap. Now let's also discuss the India-Venezuela ties. The two countries have shared warm, long-standing relations. In the political segment, there have been regular high-level meetings and visits. For example, in 2005, President Hugo Chavez visited India, and there have been high-level meetings on the sidelines of United Nations General Assembly, NAM, as well as BRICS summits, etc. And in the past 3 years, every year, the Executive Vice President of Venezuela has visited India. The MOU was signed on the sharing of successful digital solutions. In the economic sphere, the exports from India include mineral fuels, oils, pharmaceuticals, cotton, machinery and chemicals to Venezuela. The imports from Venezuela are mostly in the oil sector, iron and steel, aluminium and copper. The trade between the two countries have fluctuated significantly. For example, it was a high of more than $6 billion in 2019-20 and it came down to just about $1 billion in 2023-24. In the energy sector, there is cooperation. For example, ONGC Videsh has a joint venture in the San Cristobal oil field. Reliance Industries has a long-term crude oil supply contract with the state-owned oil company of Venezuela. In the cultural sector, there are annual celebrations of the International Day of Yoga in Venezuela. Also, there are India chairs at the Venezuelan universities and cultural centers. For example, the Mahatma Gandhi Cultural Center in Venezuela. The ITEC program provides Indian scholarships to the Venezuelan students also. There is a small diaspora community also in Venezuela comprising about 50 NRIs and 30 PIOs as well. There is a means practice question also. The military action by the United States in Venezuela is another example of US interventionism. Examine India's interests and diplomatic choices in the context of India-Venezuela relations. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the declining fertility and the trends in total fertility rate in India, as Telangana ended the two-child ceiling for contesting the local body polls there. Earlier, people who had more than 2 children could not contest the local body elections in Telangana. Now that ceiling has been removed because the fertility has been declining. Therefore, we'll discuss the trends in TFR in India, the factors behind the declining fertility in India, and also the government steps taken to ensure that the TFR remains at the replacement level of 2.1. This is important in GS1 under the topic population and its associated issues. First, let's start with some basics regarding fertility. How is it measured? What are the indicators of fertility? One of the primary indicators of fertility is the total fertility rate. The total fertility rate is measured by the number of children that the woman gives birth to during her reproductive age. That is, from the age of 15 years to 49 years, the number of children that a woman gives birth to, that indicates the total fertility rate in the country. Then next indicator is the crude birth rate. The crude birth rate is measured by the number of live births that take place per 1000 population in the country. In 2021, it was 19.3 and it has been declining at 1.12% annually since 2016. And the general fertility rate is measured by the number of live births that take place per 1000 women in a country. And the gross reproduction rate is measured by the number of daughters that are given birth to per woman in the country. And the replacement level total fertility rate is 2.1. That is, if the average number of children given birth to by a woman during her reproductive age is 2.1, then the population neither expands nor contracts, it remains stable at the same number. When we look at the TFR trends in India, it has remained stable at around 2.0, and Bihar has the highest total fertility rate of about 3, and in West Bengal and Delhi it is the lowest at around 1.4. 6 states have exceeded the replacement levels, that is the level of 2.1, that include Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh. The total fertility rate in India has declined from 2009 to 2021. We can observe this from the graph also. Now, within India also there are regional variations in the decline as well. For example, the fastest crude birth rate decline has happened in Kerala, Tamil Nadu and Delhi at twice the national rate. Whereas in Uttarakhand, it is the only state with a crude birth rate increase from 2016 to 2021. Now, what are the factors behind the declining fertility in India? One of the primary factors is the birth control programs, the family planning programs that were taken up by the government of India ever since independence. Because ever since independence, in the initial phases, there was a population expansion, a population explosion as well. Therefore, the government promoted the usage of the modern contraceptives. The usage of the modern contraceptives increased from 14% in 1970 to 56% in 2020, that is about 4 times. The women empowerment has also played a role in declining fertility levels. For example, the improvement in the literacy, the improvement in the workforce participation of the women also leads to the declining total fertility rate. For example, the women who have achieved secondary education, among them the total fertility rate is just about 1.7, that is secondary education or higher levels, whereas women who have no education at all, among them the total fertility rate is close to 2.6. Similarly, the workforce participation of the women has also reduced the TFR rate in India. For example, there are new trends now like dual income, no kids families, that the couples do not prefer to have kids, they rather prefer to work and earn more, and there is dual income, that is both the husband and wife are earning, and there is no spending on the child, therefore no kids also. In the urban areas, the TFR is 1.6 because the trend of the workforce participation of women in the urban areas is more, whereas in the rural areas its TFR is just about 2.1. The social attitudes have also impacted the declining fertility levels, as the attitudes are inclined towards having smaller families. Also, the delayed marriages are also promoted. Similarly, the improvement in the health indicators also causes people to give birth to lesser number of children. For example, the infant mortality rate has reduced because lesser number of infants die, therefore people give birth to lesser number of children. Like the infant mortality rate in 1990 was 80 out of 1000 live births. It reduced to just about 28 out of 1000 live births in 2020. Similarly, the life expectancy has also increased. In 1960, it was just about 41. In 2020, it increased to 69. Another factor is the child rearing economics. People do not want to give birth to more children because of the higher cost of child rearing, because of the urbanization. Therefore, the improvement in the quality of life, subsequently increase in the cost of living, therefore giving birth to lesser number of children. Another factor which causes changes in the population is the out migration. For example, people settling abroad, which again causes demographic changes. Now, what are the steps that the government has taken for achieving a total fertility rate of 2.1, that is ensuring that it is at the replacement levels? In the initial phases, the government came up with the National Population Policy, which was revised in 2000. It is to achieve a TFR of 2.1 by 2010 and to stabilize the population of the country by 2045. The government launched the mission Parivar Vikas. Through the mission Parivar Vikas, contraceptive access is given to the high fertility districts, especially special focus is given for them. Nai Pehel kits are distributed, Saas Bahu Sammelans are conducted, the Sarthi vans are there to ensure that there are contraceptives distribution also. The National Family Planning Indemnity Scheme provides insurance to people against the deaths, against complications or failure following the sterilization, so that the sterilization is promoted both among the males as well as females, therefore promoting the family planning and promoting the smaller families. The strategies adopted under the Janni Suraksha Karyakram include Prerna and Santushti. Through the Prerna, the delayed marriages are promoted. Through the delayed marriages, naturally the number of births that a woman gives birth to also declines, and therefore the first childbirth also is delayed, and the spacing between the first and the second childbirth is also encouraged through the Prerna. Similarly, through the Santushti, the private sector gynecologists are also encouraged to promote vasectomy. The vasectomic surgeons are also employed. Through the National Health Mission, the family planning services are also provided, again encouraging smaller families and therefore promoting declined fertility levels. Similarly, the home delivery of contraceptives is done by the ASHA workers so that the contraceptive usage can increase. The new contraceptive choices have also been promoted, for example, injectable contraceptives, progesterone only pills, etc. And at the same time, there is a 360-degree media campaign also, for example, Hum Do, Hamare Do, etc. Such initiatives of the government initially targeted for the controlling of the population explosion, the population expansion, and therefore these led to subsequently the TFR bringing down to 2.0 only. Now there is a means practice question also. Despite India achieving near replacement level fertility, population stabilization remains uneven across regions. Examine the trends in the total fertility rate in India and the determinants behind these trends. Please try to write it. The next article is related to silk and silk value chain. This is important in GS3 under the Indian economy under the topic agriculture and allied agriculture activities. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding sericulture. It involves the rearing of the silkworms. The silkworms, they eat the mulberry leaves. They can also be reared by making them eat the oak leaves, arjun leaves, etc. And they spin the cocoons and they are harvested and they are woven into silk fabrics. It is a symbol of India's history, the tradition and art. For example, the iconic silk saris like Banarsi silk saris, the Kanchipuram silk saris. And India is the second largest producer of the silk, and India is also the largest consumer of the silk. The major mulberry silk producers are the states Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Jammu and Kashmir and West Bengal, and the non-mulberry silks are produced in the states Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha and the northeastern states. It has been significant for Indian economy as the raw silk production has increased from 2017-18 of about 32,000 metric tons to about 39 metric tons in 2024, and recently it has increased to about 41,000 metric tons. Similarly, the export of silk and silk goods has also increased from the 2017 levels of about 1649 crores to about 2000 crores now, and the growth in mulberry plantation and silk production has also increased simultaneously over the past half a decade. Let's also look at the government steps for promoting the silk sector in India. Holistically, there is a Silk Samagra scheme which has 4 components, that is encouraging the research and development, providing training and transfer of technology to the silk farmers and the usage of the ICT, information and communication technology. Additionally, it helps in the setting up of the seed organizations, providing coordination as well as market development for the silk sector. It also provides for the quality certification scheme, therefore promoting the export brands also. Additionally, there is a raw material supply scheme. It is the renaming of the yarn supply scheme with a few modifications. It ensures the availability of the quality yarn and their blends to the eligible handloom weavers at subsidized rates, therefore providing them financial incentives. Then there is National Handloom Development Program. It supports the weavers including the silk fabric producers. It adopts a need-based approach, providing support to both the handloom weavers and the industry. And it provides support for the raw material, design, technology upgrades as well as setting up of the exhibitions, therefore promoting their sale as well. It helps in the creation of permanent infrastructure, for example setting up of the urban hearts and the marketing complexes. Also, the government has the Samarth scheme for the textile sector as a whole, the scheme for capacity building in the textile sector. It is under the Ministry of Textiles. It is a demand driven and placement oriented program. Here the training is provided, entry level training is provided to the youth. The upskilling and reskilling is done in the apparel and garmenting sector, in the handloom, handicraft, silk as well as jute. Now, coming to the article, the Central Silk Board has an ambitious target of doubling India's silk value chain by 2030. Currently, it is pegged at about 55,000 crore. The Central Silk Board is a body that works under the Ministry of Textiles, and it is responsible for the overall development of the silk sector in India. India's current production of the raw silk is about 41,000 metric tons. Over 70% of this is mulberry based, remaining is eri, tezer and muga. The production outlook for 2030 is about 54,000 metric tons. That is our aim. And the increase of the production of silk will be done by increasing the land under cultivation and also ensuring that there is productivity enhancement of the existing silk farms. There will be mechanization and usage of technology which will be given priority for increasing the production, and all the states in India except Rajasthan, because of its warm weather, are producing silk now. Even Gujarat is also producing silk now. The next article is related to the Japanese investments in India. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developed Countries and Developing Countries on India's Interests and Indian Diaspora. Before coming to the article, let's discuss the significance of India-Japan ties. The two countries have shared warm and cordial relations. From a geo-economic perspective, Japan is important for us because it has given major financial commitments to India, as it has committed to invest 10 trillion yen in India over the next decade. It is also a major source of FDI into India. It is the fifth largest source of FDI into India. Also, Japan is important for India for ensuring strategic economic diversification. For example, the diversification of the supply chains away from China. For that, we will need Japan. Similarly, there is the proposed Economic Security Initiative. Through the Economic Security Initiative, there will be further collaboration in certain areas, including critical minerals, semiconductors, and also the clean energy, renewable energy. Similarly, there will be enhanced collaboration for the strategic financing for the security as well. Geostrategically looking, Japan has moved away from the pacifist restraint to a security engagement. For example, after the World War II, through the Article 9 of the 1947 Constitution of Japan, Japan had renounced the sovereign right to war. It was not maintaining the air defense or the naval forces for itself, but the subsequent regimes interpreted the provision that they could maintain at least the self-defense forces, and through the 2014 Shinzo Abe's framework, it was again revised. Therefore, now Japan is moving towards a security engagement because of the active threats from, for example, the North Korean missile threats, the increasing Chinese military threats, etc. Similarly, there will be enhanced defense and security cooperation needed between Japan and India. For example, the conducting of the exercises, the Malabar exercise between India, Japan, US and Australia, the Milan multilateral naval exercise, the JIMEX bilateral maritime exercise, the Dharma Guardian army exercise. Also, there can be operational convergences between the two countries in terms of the defense forces. Also, there are shared strategic concerns between the two countries over China as well. For example, there is increased Chinese military assertiveness that can be seen both in the South China Sea and also in the East China Sea. Therefore, both the countries, India and Japan, advocate for a free and open Indo-Pacific region. Similarly, there are territorial tensions between China and Japan also, and between China and India also. For example, between China and Japan regarding the Senkaku Islands, and between China and India regarding the India-China border dispute. Geopolitically as well, we need Japan, for example, for ensuring that there is a rules-based global order, there is a multipolar order, and the ties between the two countries are based upon non-zero-sum engagement. That is, the relations are not for creating dependencies upon each other, rather for ensuring there is mutual cooperation and collaboration for the mutual benefit. And the ties between the two can serve as the cornerstone of the Indo-Pacific strategy, and India's strategic anchor can be Japan. For example, during the times when there is uncertainty regarding the US cooperation and there are fears regarding the Chinese tariff barriers, etc., then Japan can function as our strategic anchor. And at the same time, both need to maintain their strategic autonomy, and Japan can also provide the stability in the Quad as well. Technologically, Japan can also help us by providing us advanced technology transfer. For example, the bullet train, the Shinkansen technology for the high-speed rail to India, and the upgradation of the digital partnership includes the cooperation in the artificial intelligence and the startup ecosystems also. The other areas of significance include the maritime domain awareness. For example, the ensuring of the smart islands in the Andaman Nicobar. A model for regional cooperation can be the India-Japan model of cooperation, and the two countries have a long-term strategic intent to maintain the deeper relations as well as cordial ties, and the tourism and diaspora can also function as another pillar of the relations between the two countries. Now coming to the article, the Japanese investments in India via the mergers and acquisitions have reached a historic high in 2025. Now, this has been attributed to Japan's structural economic challenges. For example, Japan has faced 30 years of deflation. They have an aging population with the average age of the population above 60, and they have abundant liquidity, but they have limited growth opportunities. India, on the other hand, is poised for expansion over the next decade, and therefore India fits into the Asian century narrative. The global dynamics have also shaped Japan's capital flows. For example, they don't want to invest much in Europe because Europe is increasingly viewed as an economically stagnant region, and geopolitical uncertainty is also rising. Therefore, the US security commitments are also shifting. At the same time, Japan's strained ties are there in the Southeast Asia and China, which have narrowed their investment comfort zone. And apart from China, there is no other Asian economy other than India which can absorb such large investments. Also, the Japanese investments, they also feel culturally and operationally aligned with India. Therefore, the Japanese investments into India have been increasing. The next article is related to the primary market surge and the subsequent promoter exits. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy. Before coming to the article, let's discuss the basics regarding the primary market and secondary market, and also the IPOs and the offers for sale. The difference between the primary market and secondary market is related to the issuance of the securities. Here, the securities are issued directly by the company or the government in the primary market, whereas in the secondary market, the securities are traded, that is the stocks or shares, they are traded between the investors. And the participants in the primary market involve the issuers, the underwriters and the initial investors, whereas in the secondary markets, the trading is done among the investors themselves. Similarly, the prices are set by the issuer himself in the primary market, whereas in the secondary market, the demand and supply, they determine the price of the stocks or the shares. In the primary market, the purpose is for raising the new capital, whereas in the secondary market, it is for the trading of the existing securities. Similarly, in the primary market, the risks are higher because the investments are in the new securities, for example, the initial public offerings for the stocks, whereas in the secondary market, the risks are lower because the investors can observe what is the market appetite, what is the market performance before buying those shares. Now let's also observe the difference between the initial public offerings and the offer for sale. The purpose of IPO is to raise the fresh capital for the company, whereas the offer for sale is a method for the existing promoter or the existing investor to exit from the company. It allows the existing shareholders to sell their shares. Similarly, the IPO involves the issuance of new shares, whereas in the offer for sale, there are no new shares which are given, rather the existing shares are sold by the existing shareholders. In the IPO, the beneficiary is the company, the funds go to the company, whereas in the offer for sale, the beneficiaries are the existing shareholders which are divesting their stakes. The participants in the IPO can include retail and institutional investors, whereas in the offer for sale, usually the target is the institutional investors. The regulatory process is more complex in the IPOs, whereas in the offer for sale, the regulatory process is simpler and faster. Now coming to the article, from 1989 to 2012, the offer for sale that made up an average of just about 13% of the total issuing amount. 87% were the fresh capital that were being sought, but from 2013 onwards, 68% of the total IPO amount has been through the offer for sale rather than the issuance of the fresh shares. Now what is the concern in this? The concern is that the high volume of promoters are diluting their stakes in the businesses through the offers for sale, and this is accounting for about 45% of the total IPO amount raised in 2025. The traditional risk takers, they used to be the promoters. Now what we are witnessing is that the next generation of the promoter family, they are not willing to invest in that business. Rather, they are setting up family offices abroad and they are looking to invest in the global markets and the other asset classes rather than investing in the same business in India. Another concern is there is a lower percentage of the fresh capital which is going towards the expansion. For example, the data points out that only 31% of the amount that is used through the fresh capital, that is raised through the fresh capital, is utilized for expansion, buying new machinery, new plant, etc. Whereas 26% of the fresh capital is used for the retirement of the debt and 23% for the usage as the working capital rather. The next article is related to the empathy in legal system. This is important in GS4 under the topic empathy, tolerance and compassion towards the weaker sections. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding empathy. First, what is empathy? Empathy is the ability to place oneself into the shoes of another. The understanding of the emotions of another, the comprehension of the feelings of another, and understanding the problem from another's perspective. For example, understanding the problem of hunger by fasting. Like an empathetic public servant will install ramps in his office to ensure that the persons with disabilities are also able to easily access his office. Now, why is empathy required? Because it is embedded in the Indian ethos. For example, Siddharth Gautam said, Bahujan Hitai, Bahujan Sukhai, Lok Anukampai. That is, for the good of the many, for the happiness of the many, and out of compassion for the world. Similarly, Tiruvalluvar said, real kindness seeks no return. After all, what return can the earth give to the rain-bearing clouds? Vivekananda said Daridra Narayan. Through this concept, he promoted that the service to poor is the service to God. Therefore, empathy is essential. Mother Teresa said, if we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. We need to be empathetic towards each other. Dalai Lama said, love and compassion are necessities. They are not luxuries. Without love and compassion, humanity cannot survive. The John F. Kennedy observed that if a free society cannot help the many who are poor, then it cannot save the few who are rich. Similarly, Plato said, be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a harder battle. In the words of Mark Twain, kindness is a language that the deaf can hear and the blind can see. And specifically for the civil servants, the Rudyard Kipling observed that the civil servants need to have that kind of an attitude that they can walk among the kings, yet they should not lose the common touch. Now, why empathy is not valued as much in the Western societies? Because they believe that man is a rational animal. Man takes decision based upon rationality, and it is not even included as one of the values recommended by the Nolan Committee as well, as it is seen to be contradictory with objectivity at times, because objectivity is given higher emphasis there. For example, the objectivity can induce short-term pain, but in the long term it will lead to the right result. For example, a doctor can give an injection. It can induce a short-term pain, but in the long term it will lead to a gain, that is, it will cure the disease. But if a doctor is too empathetic, then his hands will tremble while giving the injection. Similarly, the empathy is targeted towards the individual, whereas the objectivity looks at the masses. For example, if the judge is sentencing a criminal, if the judge is too empathetic, then he might be giving a lenient punishment to the criminal, which will hurt the masses in the long run. That is the belief in the Western societies. Now, coming to the article, the Chief Justice of India, Surya Kant, has asserted that the empathy in the legal system distinguishes a just society from an unjust one. We need to bend the arc of justice also towards the communities that need it the most, so that there is empathy. The next article is related to the white-bellied heron. This is important in GS3 under the topic environment conservation. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few facts regarding herons and white-bellied herons. The herons are about 60 species of the long-legged wading birds. They wade in waters. They are classified in the family Erdidae, including egrets and bitterns. They are found commonly in the tropics. They feed in the shallow waters of the pools, marshes and swamps. They catch the frogs, fishes and the other aquatic animals. They nest in the rough platforms of the sticks constructed in bushes or trees near water, and these nests are grouped in colonies called heronries. The heronry counts are an effective way to determine the breeding population of the water birds in an area. Since they are one of the top predators in the aquatic food chain, their population indicates the health of the aquatic ecosystem. Therefore, coming specifically to the white-bellied heron, this is the second largest living species of heron. They are found in Bhutan, Myanmar and in Arunachal Pradesh in India. Their conservation status as per IUCN, they are listed as critically endangered and they are conserved in the Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Protection Act in India. They are facing the threats because of the loss and degradation of the lowland forests and the wetlands, and also because of the natural forest fires which destroy their nests as well. Now coming to the article, the Union Environment Ministry expert panel has given the environmental clearance for the Kalai 2 hydroelectric project on the Lohit River in Arunachal Pradesh. But there are omissions about the presence of the critically endangered white-bellied heron bird in the Lohit River basin from the proposal's EIA report, the Environment Impact Assessment report. In 2020, the EAC had itself sought a detailed conservation plan for the heron species while extending the clearance for the Lower Dameway project also proposed on the Lohit River. Thank you.